markets, the momentum around ownership transparency continues to grow and is very strong. The B team, we've been championing beneficial ownership transparency for several years now, and really thanks to the hard graft of civil society over many years, and more recently due to the Panama Papers leak just last year, this issue is now really firmly in the spotlight. Importantly, and what we're really here to discuss today is how business are now at the forefront of ownership transparency as a movement, and championing the business case for action, and really increasingly recognizing that ownership transparency is not only a solution for reducing corruption and stemming illicit financial flows, but really is a fundamental foundation of a healthy and thriving business environment, and really key for the stability of our competitive markets. So I'm delighted to introduce you to three really outstanding business leaders in this area who make up the panel today. We have Leda Pramer from BMO Capital Markets, James Swenson from Thomson Reuters, and Chip Cottrell from Deloitte. What we're going to talk you through today, or introduce you to today, is what is beneficial ownership transparency, why it matters, how business and investors are really increasingly needing and demanding access to beneficial ownership information for robust risk management and due diligence, and importantly, why business should be opening up and becoming more transparent themselves. We have a newly launched website which we've developed in partnership, which provides business and investors on guidance on becoming more transparent, and we'll be also introducing this to you too. So we hope that the session is really insightful. As Neha outlined, there will be time for questions at the end. Keep them coming throughout the session. Type them into the box and indicate who you'd like to direct the question to, Chip, Leda, or James, and we'll endeavour to answer all of those. So to begin to set the scene, we thought we'd just start with a short video. So I encourage you to turn up your sound and tune in. Okay, we seem to have no sound there. So I think, Neha, unless you have a quick solution, we'll move on. It was really just to tantalize and tease our first presenter anyway. So I will now introduce our first presenter, Leda Pramer. Some background on Leda. She has more than 20 years experience in Canadian capital markets and is currently the Director of Global Anti-Money Laundering Compliance at BMO Capital Markets. And over the years, Leda's been really heavily involved in the B20 Anti-Corruption Task Force beneficial ownership workstream, and really contributed widely to advancing beneficial ownership transparency as a way to make the banking and finance system safer, more transparent, and to restore institutional trust. So thank you, Leda. I will now pass to you to take over.
Thank you very much, Madeline, and a big thank you to including me to speak today, and for all the hard work in putting together this webinar from the B team and as well from the UN Global Compact. I'm going to go over the high-level global policy actions this morning, and due to time constraints, this overview will not be exhaustive. I mean, believe me, I can go on for hours, but think of this as a bit of a crash course that will set the most immediate scene for the global landscape on this issue. Now, what I like to do is I always start with the beneficial ownership definition. I like to level set and to make sure that everybody's on the same page. And what we've been doing over the last few years is using the Financial Action Task Force definition for beneficial ownership, because it really is the recognized organization that provides guidance to industry. Now, this definition refers to the natural person or persons who ultimately owns or controls a customer and or the natural person on whose behalf a transaction is being conducted. This also includes those persons who exercise ultimate effective control over a legal person or arrangement. Now, it's important to note that effective control is almost as important, if not more important, than beneficial ownership, because these are who the decision makers are, and oftentimes they can be behind the scenes. So if we move on to the next slide, please, ma'am. I'm going to give you a bit of background. I'm going to start with the G20. Because we have been so heavily involved with the B20, which is the business engagement arm of the G20, I wanted to give you a bit of background on how did we get here. So back in 2013 at the G8 summit in the UK, beneficial ownership was first brought to the table. A year later, in 2014, at the G20 Brisbane summit, the high-level principles on beneficial ownership transparency were created. Now, these again were based on the Financial Action Task Force recommendations, and that's important because we had uniform, consistent global guidance. This is something that continuously until now had been a bit of a problem, because when you are trying to do business in different parts of the world and different parts of the world have different regulation, this increases your cost, it increases complexity, the risk for being non-compliant, and so on. So again, at the G20 Brisbane Summit, an action plan was created, and the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group oversaw the creation of national action plans that each member country had to create by the end of 2016. And I'm really proud to say that about 19, because the G20 is 19 countries plus the EU, 19 have published action plans, and you can find them all on our website, ownershiptransparency.com. At the G20 Hangzhou Summit in September 2016, a new action plan was also created. So the 2017-18 Anti-Corruption Action Plan. And there was one very specific point within that action plan on beneficial ownership. And it stated that it was to promote the identification of the true beneficial ownership and control of companies and legal arrangements, including trusts, wherever they are located, and to encourage and support other countries to implement beneficial ownership standards and best practices. So that was the commitment from the leaders. And the major recommendation from the B20 to the leaders was promoting a more transparent environment for business in order to bolster competition. Because when you have an open, transparent environment, competition, free competition, is what then impacts economic growth, which leads to job creation, which leads to increased GDP, and this is something that all of the leaders in different commitments through the summit have been looking for. So over the last few years, the B20, under varying support levels from the host governments, has been working on beneficial ownership agenda. In early 2015, the B20 members on this webinar, we came together and decided to take decisive action on business consultation and lobbying of the governments through the B20, and we do this through working with the G20 Anti-Corruption Working Group to ensure that the national action plans were uniform and also that they stayed on track. So we sat down, and at the beginning, well, I guess we first started in May 2015 through to the launch of the website, ownershiptransparency.com. We launched that at the International Anti-Corruption Conference held in December 2016 in Panama. We decided to hold workshops so that we had industry consultation on, we could talk about challenges, potential solutions, and best practices around ascertaining beneficial ownership. So 8 workshops were held in Paris, Nairobi, Delhi, New York, London, Beijing, Dubai, and Panama City. We had over 250 companies from a wide variety of industries. And some of the main points that came out of that were that realistically everybody supported public access to information in order to reduce the cost and complexity of the due diligence needed. There was also strong expression for verification and enforcement processes to ensure data quality. Now, this was most recently reinforced as well by a letter from the Clearinghouse Association in the United States. They sent a letter to lawmakers in support of the Incorporation Transparency and Law Enforcement Assistance Act. And what it did was it went further than just to support the act itself, where people had to, or companies had to report the beneficial owners to the state. It requested that lawmakers consider granting access to financial institutions for beneficial ownership, because access and the due diligence that is required of different institutions, if we could all go to one place, or if there was somewhere that corporations could easily access the information, it would drastically cut down on cost and complexity. So we found really that the big challenge is access and information sharing. So as some of you may know, after the Panama Papers came out, there was an information sharing agreement brought forward from France, the UK, Germany, Spain, and Italy that for beneficial ownership sharing of companies and trusts. And they urged their G20 colleagues to do the same, but they also recognized a need for an enforcement action mechanism. Now, with all the media attention around the Panama Papers, the Luxembourg leaks, the Bahamas leaks, governments now have the will of the people behind them to act politically. And that's something that's very different from years past, because before the drama of the Panama Papers and every day hearing in the news, political leaders exposed and companies exposed, politicians didn't have the will of the people. This wasn't something that was popular thought. So these things really brought this to the forefront. Some of the other challenges that we found were that, in some countries, the lack of legal requirement to disclose the information because of privacy laws created an obstacle. When there was a percentage threshold given, if no owner above the threshold, then if there was no owner, then the list was empty. And as we know, the world is relatively landing at the 25% threshold for beneficial ownership, but we do encourage, and some countries are going down to 10% and even lower, we do encourage companies to go beyond the 25% threshold. Trust and shell companies, they pose a particularly acute challenge, and this is something that is now looking to be addressed, and I'll get to that in a minute through the UK and the EU registries. And global regulatory inconsistency. This is where the B20 really tried to play a part to have those national action plans be consistent in order to decrease some of the challenges for business. But overall, the problem is too big for either government or business to dictate to the other what needs to be done. Cooperation is the only way to achieve success in this. So to finish off on the B20, currently we're under the German presidency for 2017. This year is a very short cycle. So we have the B20, G20 in September in China, and we only have until the beginning of May, where the B20 is going to be held in Berlin, like the 2nd and 3rd of May. So we had from really the September through to May for this cycle. The Germans created a cross-thematic group called Responsible Business Conduct and Anti-Corruption, where beneficial ownership was the #1 issue. And there have been several meetings so far and a lot of discussion on access. And currently, they've received the edits, recommendations, proposals on their 2nd draft of the policy paper. They've incorporated a lot of what was brought forward in the 1st draft. And there's going to be a joint task force, joint task force meeting in May in Paris, where the policy paper will be finalized and handed over at that B20 summit in May. The G20 summit itself is going to be in July in Hanover, so there is time for the leaders to consider everything that is written in the policy recommendation paper. And right now there are some gaps for implementation from the different countries. It's an area of focus and also compliance for government on their commitments. Now, if we move on to take a look at registries, the UK led the initiative by implementing a public registry of people with significant control that went live in June 2016, which is updated annually. And in September, they began discussions on a register of beneficial ownership of trust. This is a big improvement because, as I mentioned before, trust and shell companies pose a particularly acute problem, and we heard this cross-industry through our workshop. By their very legal structure, they are meant to hide the ownership of the different trusts and shell companies. And so this is something that we're glad that the governments are now looking to address because it was a really big challenge for industry. Now, just on the whole registry item, Thomson Reuters put out a report to give you a few numbers. There are 235 countries where companies can be incorporated. 58 have some sort of corporate online registry. An offline registry, there's another 20. 45% of all jurisdictions provide director info, and 36% disclose shareholders. So we've come a bit of a way, but there's still a long way to go, obviously. Now let's look at the EU Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive. This mandated that all member states have to hold a central registry of beneficial owners by 2017, June 26th, if we're going to be precise about it. And there's a difference between these registries and the one in the UK because this one is updated when there's a change, whereas the UK registry is updated annually. Now, various groups, for example, the European Central Bank, the European Banking Authority, ECOFIN Council, Bank for International Settlements, and FATF, they've all come together to look at how to enhance the Fourth Anti-Money Laundering Directive. And this is where business can make a difference. For example, the Association of German Bankers has openly stated that they back tougher ownership rules, and especially for trusts. So discussions are continuing over the next several weeks on different points under discussion, but some of them include, designate virtual currency exchange platform as obliged entities, set lower maximum transaction limits for certain prepaid instruments. The two that actually, there are a couple more, but the two that I think for us are most pertinent, the first one is to improve access to beneficial ownership registers. And this is where trusts are going to be discussed, the inclusion of trusts, where making certain information public is going to be discussed, and also the interconnection of the registers, so direct interconnection of the registers to facilitate cooperation between member states. So everybody really is looking at a couple of things. One, information sharing, and two, access, and three, trust. Trusts have to be part of the registers in order to make them even more viable. Now, exciting news to let you know is that there is a global register that has been in the works, and it's an existing effort that governments and companies are already involved in with open ownership. And more information can be found about the global register on our website, ownershiptransparency.com, under Taking Action. There's one of the things you can commit to is to commit to publish your ownership data on the global register. And it's already in beta development, and it's funded by the UK government. It's going to pull data from countries with public registers and allowing companies to self-disclose and encourage or incentivize disclosure by suppliers and partners. So this is a platform where we can pool the data, because right now with registers in all different countries, it's a lot easier for corporations to be able to go to one place. So I encourage you to go to the website and take a look at and join the global registry and the work that's being done there. And what about the U.S.? Well, in the spring of 2016, the Treasury Department finalized a rule on beneficial ownership where now you need to collect information on who owns or controls down to 25% when a company forms or transfers to the U.S. And reporting is now extended to single-member LLCs, even foreign-owned, which were previously exempt. So that's actually, it's a big deal for the U.S. to finally come out with this rule. I know it's been long awaited. Now I want to talk to you quickly, because I know I'm running out of time.
We might have to wrap up now, Lida. In a couple of 1 minute.
Okay, 1 minute. So EITI is truly a success story. The extractive industry, they're the best example of industry consultation before putting a plan into action. So they started in 2015 with a pilot project to assess the feasibility of requiring beneficial ownership information disclosure for companies that bid for, operate, or invest in, or have assets in the extractive industry, which we know has never been known for transparency. 11 countries took part in the pilot, with 6 others that were interested. And in December 2015, the International Board agreed to make beneficial ownership transparency an obligation on its membership, which is approximately 50 countries. And the great news is that by 2020, all EITI countries will publish the identity of oil and gas and mining companies, as I said, that bid for, operate, or invest in extractive projects in the countries. There's a few more items that go with it, and you can go to their website and read all about it, but it really is a success story. And by February of this year, 45 EITI countries have published beneficial ownership roadmaps, which outline how they're going to publish this information. So just to finally wrap it up, and I know it's more than a minute, sorry, why did the B Team, Bank of Montreal, Deloitte, and Thomson Reuters decide to lead the charge on this and to build the ownershiptransparency.com website? It's because knowing who you're doing business with matters, and ultimately we want to restore public trust. We want to help companies navigate through the myriad of global rules and regulations. We want to help stop the illicit flow of funds, increase global competitiveness for all sizes of companies, of course, avoid reputational and legal risks and risks of fines and the cost of remediation. And really at its core, it's the right thing to do. So I know some of these are altruistic reasons and some of them purely business, to be sure, but all roads lead to the fact that we all win when there's a level playing field. Thank you.
Thank you, Lida. That was a really thorough overview of the regulatory landscape and really what's happening around that across the world. Now I'm going to introduce you to James Swenson. James is the Global Head of Proposition for Risk Managed Services at Thomson Reuters. This is a division that provides customers with due diligence and know your customer onboarding solutions. James is a real subject matter expert in anti-money laundering, anti-bribery, corruption, and enhanced due diligence. So he's going to talk to you about going beyond compliance and just picking up where Lida left off, the importance of knowing who you're doing business with. So James, over to you.
Great, thank you, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. If we can maybe move to the next slide. As Lida mentioned before, we at Thomson Reuters did a survey after the Panama Papers, really trying to understand what the current state of affairs was in terms of existing public registries that published ownership information. So, we found that when we surveyed around 235 jurisdictions, only around 36% disclosed some sort of shareholder information. And I think it's really important to explain that just because a registry has shareholder information available doesn't necessarily mean that this is something that can be used to identify the ultimate beneficial owner. So effectively, what organizations try to do when they unwrap corporate structures or they're looking for ownership information is to get down to the ultimate individuals who own and control those entities. So one of the things that we found when we were navigating these 36% of jurisdictions that had registry information is that oftentimes, even though shareholder information is available, it can be in a very complex format that really doesn't help identify who that ultimate beneficial owner is. And there's really 2 common scenarios that we found in this particular situation. One is you go into a public registry to look for the ownership information of a corporate entity, and you end up with a shareholder that's another corporate. So an example would be you'd go to look to see who the owners of company ABC are, and it turns out that the owners are registered as another corporate XYZ. So you have to kind of follow this trail, and sometimes you go 3, 4, 5 levels down until you're able to identify who the individuals are behind that corporate structure. Another common scenario that we see is cross-jurisdictional ownership, which really is a challenge, because if you think that only 36% of jurisdictions in the world offer ownership information, and you go into a registry that has that information available, you look up company ABC, and it turns out that it's owned by a corporate that's registered in a jurisdiction where the information is not publicly available, then effectively you're not identifying who those shareholders are. So there's a lot of kind of, you can get pieces of the jigsaw puzzle to start to understand who the owners are, but if you rely purely on publicly available information, it can be very challenging due to transparency and due to the complexity of the way that a lot of this information is structured. Another point that's important to look at when you're navigating corporate registries is to try to understand that if information is available, how accurate and how timely is that information. So we know that some registries, even though they publish shareholding information, it might be that they publish only the shareholders that were registered when that company was incorporated, and not necessarily any changes that have subsequently happened in the shareholding structure of that organization. Other registries, for example, will also publish updates only when company filings are registered with the registry. So it might be that you're waiting a whole 12-month cycle before shareholder information is updated in the publicly available section of that registry to be able to get accurate and timely information. So, you know, one of the things that I think Lito described around some of these initiatives around registry is really also looking at a standardization of that information. So when you're navigating registry information, you at least know kind of what you're looking at and what you're getting. If we can move on to the next slide. So I thought it would be useful to just kind of highlight what some of the risks are and why navigating and why identifying ultimate beneficial shareholder information is an important component of mitigating certain risks. So when organizations look at third parties, and by third parties I can mean your customers, your clients, your suppliers, distributors, anybody who you do business with or anybody who does business on your behalf, one of the common guidance notes out of a lot of the regulatory enforcement that governs due diligence and vetting, know your customer type of activity, is to be able to identify who ultimately controls and owns the corporate entities that you're contracting with. And there's a couple of several reasons why this is really important. One is corporate entities can be registered for the purpose of just contracting with an organization. So if you're contracting with a corporate, let's say as part of a joint venture partner, it could very well be that the corporate entity that you're looking at or that you're contracting with could have been newly registered, and any real risk, any reputational damage, any prior issues that might present a risk is really going to lie with the individuals that are controlling that corporate entity. So for bribery and corruption type due diligence, when you're looking at third parties that are doing business on your behalf, it's important to understand and be able to show a regulator that you've done due diligence on the individuals behind that corporate to be able to mitigate against any risks. The same holds true when you're looking at financial crime perspective in terms of money laundering or terrorism financing. The real risk is probably going to lie with the individuals behind the corporate and not necessarily with the corporate itself. I also wanted to highlight the importance of identifying beneficial ownership as part of a sanctions regime. So what we saw in some of the latest sanctions that were issued by the Treasury Department around the Russian-Ukrainian conflict was that the U.S. government has started to do what's called narrative sanctions. So while they'll put individuals on a sanctions list, as part of the narrative behind that sanction, they also state that organizations where that individual is a majority shareholder can also be liable under the same sanction regime, but they don't necessarily list out those corporates. So one of the things that we saw was a lot of organizations that had contractual relationships with Russian organizations, for example, were really scrambling to understand who was behind those corporate owners, behind those corporate structures, really to identify what their exposure was to various sanctioned regimes. So really, really important to understand who the individuals are behind the companies that you're doing business with and do business on your behalf. One of the things I wanted to highlight briefly was also just some emerging risk factors that a lot of organizations are looking at. So, for example, we've seen in the UK, Modern Slavery Act, it's really bringing to the impetus that a lot of organizations of a certain size need to publicly disclose the efforts that they take to eliminate forced and bonded labor in their supply chain. We're seeing a lot of organizations expand their due diligence around third parties to include environmental crime. We have organizations in the U.S. that under regulatory regimes need to disclose efforts around eliminating conflict minerals in their supply chain. And all of this is part to be able to truly vet these third parties, identifying the individuals behind the organizations is a key step to that process. Next slide, please. So one of the issues that a lot of organizations struggle with, particularly if they haven't included the identification of ultimate beneficial ownership as part of their initial onboarding of third parties, is this whole concept of where do I begin now? So let's say you're an organization with 1,000 or 2,000 third parties. Where do you start to retroactively do due diligence to ensure that you are aware of who the individuals are behind some of the corporates that you look at? So one of the ways of doing that is going through a risk-based approach to really understand which suppliers might pose a greater risk than others. And I won't go through all of these, but some of the variables that a lot of organizations will use is the jurisdictional risk. So as we saw earlier in the webinar, there are certain countries and territories where we know there's a lack of transparency, so that should indicate some additional risk. You might want to look at the types of third parties that you're dealing with. So oftentimes corporate entities that are used as part of consulting contracts or by intermediaries oftentimes pose a greater risk than larger organizations that you might be dealing with. You may also want to look at some of your third parties that directly interact with government on your behalf. That generally poses a greater bribery and corruption risk. And finally, there might be some inherent risks within the industry that you're operating with that might make certain industries like mining, extractives, oil and gas, more susceptible to third-party risk than other industries. And then finally, on the next slide, I wanted to just also highlight that the Ownership Transparency website has some really useful guidance for corporations in terms of setting up third-party risk programs, looking at bribery and corruption as part of that third-party population, and also some of the ways that organizations are dealing with the whole issue around transparency. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much, James. A very compelling discussion of third-party risks there. I'm now going to put to Chip Cottrell. Many of you may know Chip. He's the chair of the UNGC Committee on Anti-Corruption. Is highly active in contributing to anti-corruption efforts globally, really, in a variety of forums. He is the newly appointed Global Chief Ethics and Sustainability Officer at Deloitte. And he's really been leading the industry to kind of step up collectively and play a larger role in addressing the challenges of corruption and the role of anonymous companies in fueling that. So I will hand over to Chip. He'll introduce how investors are really backing beneficial ownership transparency to safeguard against investment risk. Over to you, Chip.
Thank you very much. I trust you can hear me well. I'm having some interesting IP issues here this morning, and it's interesting. The whole construct of in looking at transparency and beneficial ownership was driven home very clear to me as I was involved in the looking at the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, BCCI. Though there may be those of you on the phone that remember that name or may have actually been involved and suffered on some of the downsides of that. That was an exceptional example, in my opinion, and in many others' opinions, I think, of how difficult it can be, and it does get, to understand particular holdings. It was a scheme that was pulled together that took the better part of 24 years to unwind. It was a global banking structure, and the investors in that bank, be they depositors, be they shareholders, be they regulatory stakeholders in the various countries where this bank was operating or arms of this bank were operating. At the end of the day, they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. And it took this 24 years, and I can speak to some specific examples where you were looking at charts where, as James said, you might have to go 3, 4, 5 levels. In this instance, we had to go 25 and 26 levels to get to the right, to understand where some of the holdings actually were. The exercise, BCCI actually was insolvent, became insolvent, was liquidated. But through understanding how the networks worked, there was close to 90% of all of the monies that had been invested in these entities were actually recovered because of the ability of effectively forensically to look at some of these of the components and be able to go to legal jurisdictions and gather that information. I guess an emphasis to both Lita and James's commentaries around some of the importance for this. They are, those of you who could see me and I was on video, you could see me pounding a table right now, alongside a number of other stakeholders around the world around shared values and looking at the necessity, the absolute critical necessity for disclosure on who they're investing their monies with. You know, the example here of $135 billion in value wiped off the map because of suspicions in many instances, and practical realities in others of involvement in potential wrongdoing. And you hear characteristically that someone has you're using nominee directors or nominee shareholders or nominee companies, and the reality is that there are some truly valid reasons for doing that, and there are, I think, one of the more prominent ones that has come out has been when the discussions of holding real estate that the famous actors or actresses don't want people know where they're living, and you know, okay, that's part of that process, and there are valid reasons for that, and there are processes set up to be able to deal with that. But when people are investing money, and they're investing, whether you're investing through investment funds or otherwise, you are making certain assumptions and by necessity having to evaluate a level of trust of the characters and the character rather of a wide range of network. This is, I mean, this isn't intellectually challenging. It's a fact and it's a reality. $135 billion off of 400 companies almost overnight. That is a huge impact. I have had the pleasure of getting in front of a number of investment funds from around the world that are promulgating this as part of their initiatives to look at the way they're investing and on a fiduciary basis the monies that they have from either pension schemes, shareholders. An excellent example of this is Case Depot which is a very significant investor in Canada, running and managing a wide range of pension scheme allocations in Canada, and they have taken an absolute stand, very similar to the types of things you're seeing in continental Europe. That if there are any activities of a particular organization that are sheltered as in offshore trust funds or otherwise, and that isn't fully transparent, they will not invest. Now, this is, follow the money and put your money where your mouth is. They're doing that exact analysis. There's an increasing need globally for us to raise the profile of this. Now, certainly there are going to be countries where the risks are higher around these investment considerations, and James mentioned, as part of a risk-based analysis of looking at third-party considerations, and whether it's the Transparency International lists or the World Economic Corruption Index or others, it is important that you understand that there is going to be a varying adoption of this based upon the criteria of the particular indices or exchanges, if you're going into public networks or otherwise. I think that it is not too much of a stretch to also connect the shared value analysis, which is essentially the understanding of maybe some non-financial aspects to investment criteria and returns, such as what a particular organization or investment vehicle is doing for a community, doing for in other intangible type aspects, and then looking at that in light of the impact that the investments are going to be made. So whether it's social investing, whether it's considered a pure financial investing, whether or not it's a social impact fund or otherwise, having the transparency and understanding this is even more important. I would be, and I'm going to finish with a reference to the Odebrecht matters. And those of you that aren't familiar with Odebrecht, I encourage you to go and Google it. It is a live series of masking to a really large extent. A Brazilian-based construction company, in part connected with the Petrobras scenario, but just recently a number of global organizations have agreed to collaborate and cooperate together to get to the bottom of the ultimate ownership and ultimate the considerations of this particular organization, as they went and paid a series of or allegedly paid a series of bribes, even though some of them have been admitted to already. But this is an example. The investors in infrastructure funds and in organizations literally around the world that took people's money, like those of us on the phone here, and essentially wasted it and and used it for inappropriate and illegal purposes. The impacts of this are going to be are ongoing for years and years from a number of different perspectives, but it is it's yet another example of how the abuse of the types of networks that we're trying to really make a stand about have been significant and almost overwhelming. So I'm going to turn it back over to the team, and I think we're going to be going in just a few minutes with some questions.
Thank you, Chip. Yes, some incredibly compelling cases of the importance of ownership transparency to investors. So, and thank you all to the speakers for an engaging session. I thought I just wanted to end highlighting, in case any of you missed it, a couple of key ways that business can really further engage in our efforts and join our efforts around the ownership transparency movement. So again, a plug to go and visit ownershiptransparency.com. You can see 6 actions that business and investors can take to become more transparent. So, Leader, if you just go to the next slide. Sorry, Neha. You'll see how you can either commit to and sign up to actions on the website, and we'll support you with guidance around how to do that, or also just be kept up to date by joining our community of companies that are increasingly becoming more transparent. Secondly, I want to just reiterate an initiative that Lida introduced, an important project, the development of open ownership, the world's first global register of beneficial ownership information that's publicly available. We are currently part of a consortium that's developing open ownership, and it's in its private beta form. So what that register will really look to do, as Lida has said, is aggregate and link together ownership data sets from across the world as they're coming online from as nations develop public registers of this information, but really important, act as a platform for socially responsible businesses to self-disclose corporate data and to enable companies and investors to more easily see who they're doing business with. So it's really an opportunity for companies to distinguish themselves as leaders in transparency, and an offering to the business community of an interlinked global data set for due diligence and risk management. So we're currently working alongside Bank of Montreal and Thomson Reuters, who are part of a private sector advisory group they're helping advise the development of that platform. We're looking for more companies to be part of this development journey too, of the open ownership beta, testing and providing feedback as to how the platform is meeting businesses' key users' needs, and businesses' contributors of data as well. So if you're interested in hearing more about this project, if you go to the next slide, Neha. Sorry, the next one. My email is, even the next one. My email is available there, and the website is also available there for you to check out the global register. But please feel free to get in touch with me and reach out if this is something that you would like to be involved with. So we have a few minutes for questions. We have received a couple that have come in. We have a question for Lida, and please keep sending these in if you do have these. We have a question for Lida from Andre Nagelmacher. So owners can also be creditors. What is the position of banks then? Should there be another relation? That's in response to your the previous discussion.
Right. Hi there. Thank you very much for the question. So just for clarity, your mention of creditors, are you speaking about them as far as effective control? So potentially if creditors have control of a company based on the percentage that they hold of a company, that they then can influence the direction of a company. If wrong, then raise your hand maybe. So I mean, this is also part of the disclosure for beneficial ownership, and it speaks directly to that Financial Action Task Force definition on making sure that we include not just, you know, who the owners are on paper as in shareholders, but also those who have effective control. And Madeline, can you just repeat the second part of that? I just want to make sure I'm answering the full question.
Sure. So owners can also be creditors. What is the position of banks then, and should there be another relation?
Well, of course, I can't speak for all banks, but the position really is, you know, we have different regulation that we have to follow in different countries. And, to the best of everybody's ability, they do follow what the guidance is from the regulators in those countries. So, beneficial ownership down to 25% in some, 10% in others, depending on where you do business. So this does fall under the definition of control.
Great, thank you, Leda. I hope that answers your question, Andre. We have another question for Oliver, and perhaps James, this might be one for you. Oliver has asked, the UK has been much lauded for its commitment to a public beneficial ownership register, but what is it really worth if it does not include trusts?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good point, and there's as I try to highlight in sort of my presentation, there's several still deficiencies, if you will, around some of the public registers, and that while there's information that is available, it may or may not be of any real value if you can't really drill down to who the ultimate beneficial owner is. So it might be great that certain registries have information that's publicly available, and sometimes that includes shareholders, but if you can't get down to the real detail of who's behind the companies, it makes that a little bit more challenging. And I think we've seen that there are trusts, there are other sort of corporate entities that sometimes are not included in some of the registries. There's some jurisdictions that even sole proprietorships won't be included in the registry information, so you can't confirm that it's a sole proprietorship necessarily through publicly available information. So I think one of the things that's needed here is that whole element of standardization, so that when individual jurisdictions are putting information in a publicly accessible format, that individuals know, the people going to those registries know what they're getting, what's available, and if something for whatever reason is not, that at least there's an explanation as to why something is not in the public domain.
Great, thank you, James. Does anyone else have anything further to add, Chip, Leda, on that particular question about how effective public beneficial ownership registers are if they don't include trusts?
It's Chip here. I would echo James's points, and I'll say I'm not a lawyer, but there are other ways to get to the value of some of the trusts, and this was an exclusion that was pushed very hard, not surprisingly, by a series of the jurisdictions that manage trusts, both within the UK and outside of the UK. The lobbying was really a significant component of this, which is why it effectively was excluded. That having been said, there are ways to access information and data, and you're not going to get 100% of this overnight, but this is a really significant components to get to this stage. And there are regulations and rules regarding trustee fiduciary responsibilities and disclosures and ways to access that under existing regulations within the UK. It is not easy. Trust me, I'm not trying to justify that or to say that this is that it is it isn't going to be an issue in many instances. But I see this as being a progression. It's a journey. It's not even a sprint. This has been one of the longer marathons I've been involved in my 40-year career, and the progress that we've just been making most recently, I think, is significant. So we'll continue to look at this, and trust me, it's got the attention of a broad range of those of us that are advocating these on both from a personal and professional perspective.
I think that was well said by my colleague, so I'll move us to the next question.
Thank you. We have a question from Rakesh here, and perhaps this is one that I can also address. What is the process? What process do you have of verifying the info on the global register? How do you flag that the information is out of date, i.e. that there has been a change in the board or ownership which has not been reported? Just as to kick off, I think this is a really critical issue, and the issue of standardization has been brought up over the course of the webinar by James and Chip. And actually, this is part of the development of the register process. We're currently working on building a data standard to help answer some of these key questions. So I'd encourage you to reach out to us if you'd like to be involved in that process of developing and thinking in this area. But it's really critical, that standardization, to know what information you're getting and the kind of flagging system that goes alongside that. But importantly, the register will pull open source, open data from national registers as they come online, so that will be a direct pull from APIs, so that information will be as up to date as what's available at a national level too. I'm not sure if any of the other panelists have anything to add there.
It's a journey.
It's a journey, exactly. If there appears to be no more questions coming in online, if anyone has we have a hand up. Let's see. You should be now unmuted, so feel free to raise your question there.
Yeah, hi. Sorry, I couldn't quite get the chat to work. But my question was, this is Abhinav from the Open Government Partnership. My question was, how does the Open Register mesh with other efforts such as Open Corporates and other efforts out there?
Yeah, absolutely. So Open Corporates is part of the consortium that's building open ownership. So really what the register will be doing, what open ownership will be doing, is pulling existing open source, open data information that's available online. We really see the EITI, the Extractors Industry Transparency Initiative data is also a key part of this register. So it's attempting to link that information that exists online into an interoperable global one-stop shop, effectively.
Great, thanks.
Pleasure.
It's Chip here. I'd like to make a plea, as other people may be thinking about questions, and that plea is, in addition to looking at the website and making commitments, but get involved in some of these processes. I realize that a number of you are. I had seen some of the pre-registration, and those of you that representing a wide range of organizations. We really want to try and expand the advocacy to the private business corporate network, as well as the NGOs and civil society. This could not be more timely for this advocacy to occur, and the more really voices that you're hearing, as usual in these kinds of circumstances, the better. The unique affiliation that Thomson Reuters, BMO, Capital Markets, and Deloitte have had on this particular issue, along with others, and it's not just the three of us, but there was the B team, UNGC, and many others here in the process. But you're seeing the visible side of this with Thomson Reuters and BMO and Deloitte. There are really a wide range of opportunities for this engagement, and in my career, I don't know that I've ever seen a time when these opportunities have been as poignant, timely and in our face. So I encourage you to do that and reach out to any of us here on the phone, whether they're from UNGC, the B team, which provides incredible leadership in this space, and or the three of us, the panelists. We'd be happy to talk to you about this, and it was an easy passion to adapt. I can assure you.
Thank you, Chip. That was remarkably well summed up. So we do have one more question that's just come in, so we'll answer that before we leave. In terms of public awareness, this question is from Anna Jones. Wonder if someone has a thought regarding how the public consumers could have access to this information and how this tool could be better communicated to the regular public. Does anyone have a leader, Chip or James?
So it's Lita. I'm assuming that by the tool you mean our website. And I think it all starts with everybody who is on this webinar today. It also started with everybody who came to every single workshop that we held over a year and a half. And it really is about using the tools that we all have at our disposal. So it's social media. It is, on the business side for myself and Chip and James, it's about encouraging our colleagues in our industries and getting them to go to the website and getting them to take action. It is speaking to the leaders in our organizations who clearly in our three organizations we have great support for this initiative. So it's not a big sell, right? But it's spreading the word. It's using social media. It's tweeting. It's getting people to go to the website and to take action. I think that's the first step, because when you have people talking on a business front, then when things are exciting that are happening that people want to get involved in, as we now have the political will from the people of countries around the world, that makes its way into the public sphere of having conversations at the water cooler, having conversations at dinner parties, and so on. So I think the first step that we would all like everyone to encourage is just to keep the conversation going and to drive people to the website.
Yeah, this is James. I would maybe add that in this whole kind of regulatory environment around companies being more proactive in terms of vetting third parties, vetting their suppliers, vetting their distributors is part, there's kind of regulatory pressure to do that in terms of identifying ultimate beneficial owners for things like anti-financial crime compliance. But one of the things that we're seeing is that a lot of organizations are also waking up to the fact that consumers are demanding increased transparency in the way that organizations do business. So some of the risk factors that I mentioned before, things like labor issues, environmental compliance, some of this is driven by regulation, but some of it is also driven by consumers, that when they're buying products or when they're engaging with organizations, they want to make sure that those organizations are operating in ethical and transparent ways. So part of this whole kind of due diligence concept can also be driven by us as consumers, going to the companies that we purchase goods and services from to make sure that they're operating in a transparent and ethical manner.
Thanks, James and Leda. One further question, and unfortunately this will be directed to you, Chip, in the first instance. It's from Peter Knutson. The question is, with Trump refusing to make his tax return available, do you really expect more transparency? And I think this echoes some of the sentiments you've previously brought up, but perhaps any closing thoughts on that there, Chip?
Yeah, so I am not a politician. I don't pretend to understand what's going on. I will, and I think anybody that does advocate that they understand what's going on in Washington or in some other major capitals of the world is not being honest with themselves. That having been said, the U.S. is, while the gorilla in the room is only one participant in this process. I have, when this first construct came around and we were looking at what we were going to be doing within the B20 framework, I made the point that I didn't think that we were going to see the kinds of transparency that we were looking for in the U.S., primarily because of the advocacies amongst the states of Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, who are as stringent on these areas as anywhere in the world. That having been said, though, that for the reasons that James and Lita and I have been talking about in the last hour and 50 minutes, there is a broader push toward understanding, and the money is going to follow this process. So the U.S. actually has got some very interesting initiatives on and continuing to be brought forward as proposals to bring the transparency into this network. And that is in spite of what's going on at the most senior levels of the U.S. government. I'm hopeful. I'm also a very pragmatic and understand that there are lots of challenges here. So his tax returns aside, there are lots of reasons why I think there will be movement, and there will be pockets of movement as more and more of these responsibilities get pushed to the state level. But there are really broader constructs of global norms that hopefully are going to have an impact here. But I'm also a realist, so it's going to be part of a longer journey.
Great, thank you so much, Chip. Just one more note that I wanted to press on in terms of that public awareness. Just to reiterate that this really is not an issue that's being, that is solely about multinational corporations. This is an issue that gets to the heart of SMEs and what it means to do business as well. So we really encourage you also down your supply chains and with small to medium enterprises that you are talking to, that you encourage this issue with them as well to create a more thriving business environment across all levels. It is 2:45 now, so we really thank you for your participation, and if you have any further questions, please feel free to send them through to us. Our email addresses are there, Neha or myself, and we'll get the panel to answer them for you. It's been a real pleasure to host this webinar, and I'd like to thank Lita and Chip and James for their contributions, and to the UN Global Compact as well. Please reach out to us. We really look forward to being in touch.
Again, thank you everyone from UN Global Compact side, to all our panelists and attendees. The slides of the presentation and perhaps the recording will be shared with the attendees. And as Madeline mentioned, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Thank you so much for joining us today.